of your professors, their research, and their academic lives here at St. Thomas. This week, we're delighted to have Professor Brooke Vetter from the Department of Biology here at St. Thomas. Welcome, Brooke.
Hi.
So to begin, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how that led you to your current research?
Sure, yeah. I can start a little bit with my academic journey. Although I grew up in Montana, I came to Minnesota for undergrad and actually attended St. Catherine University, so just down the road. I graduated there with a degree in biology. I worked for a little while at General Mills for about 3 years in their analytical labs. I had a chem minor, and so it was a really nice job for someone right out of college. And then I got interested when I was at St. Kate's in doing independent research, and so I knew I wanted to go to grad school, and so then I applied to PhD programs and ended up going to the University of Minnesota, but I was up on the Duluth campus. From there, I did a couple of postdocs, one at the U.S. Geological Survey, so I was down in Columbia, Missouri for a couple years, and then my big postdoc, kind of my main postdoc, was at the University of Washington. So I was out in Seattle for a few years. And then I started here at St. Thomas in the fall of 2020.
Nice. And then, so could you go into a little bit of detail about what your current research is, what that process looks like, and how you found it?
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll start with how I found it, because that kind of ties in with my whole academic journey. When I was an undergrad at St. Kate's, my department would do a seminar series, and so my 2B mentor came in and gave a seminar on how he studies the kind of integration of sensory physiology and behavior in fish species. And I had just taken a biopsychology course. So this was an upper level course in biology, and I loved it. I got really excited about this kind of idea of what is the sensory basis that guides our behaviors, and kind of this integration between brain and behavior work. And he had this neat summer program out at Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and I was like, I'm graduating this year. Can I join that program? And it was only for undergrads. And so, I kind of put that on the back burner. I started to apply to different neuroscience programs, and it ended up coming down to a neuroscience program here at the U, the main campus in the Twin Cities, and then his program up in Duluth. And I just got really excited about this sort of fieldwork aspect. So he studies wild-caught fish species, and that was exciting to me at the time. Of course, there's pros and cons to everything. You study a wild-caught species, and you're sort of at the whim of if you can find them, and how easy it is to study animals in the wild. But nonetheless, I still get excited about that. And so that's really what led me to my research, was finding a fit with someone who was looking for students, and I was excited about the questions that they were asking. Yeah.
And then what does that process look like today?
Yeah, my research process. Yeah, so at St. Thomas, I look at how fish are adapted to detect sounds in their environments. I think a lot of people don't realize how much fish rely on acoustic cues. There's a lot of fish species that use acoustic signals for reproduction. They'll hear acoustic cues from predators and avoid areas. They might even have kind of aggressive behaviors, defensive behaviors, and all of these can be acoustic. And so my research looks at, the behaviors that guide these acoustic-driven behaviors, looks at how environments might impact fish hearing, and then just generally, how fish are adapted to hear in their environments.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
It's something that I don't think we would normally think about.
Right. Yeah.
When you think about fish and fish behavior. For example, if I were a fisherman, would I have a harder time going out catching fish on a lake that has a lot of motorized vehicles and houses? Or would it be more an impact on the population? What would that look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. And a lot of my research does look at the impacts of human-generated sound on fish. And it's really dependent on the species. There's a lot of diversity in how fish are impacted by sound. This summer, I've been studying bluegill sunfish. So I have a colleague up at St. John's University, and they have a lake on their campus that has no motorized boat access. And so this was a great kind of little mesocosm, a little case study lake for us to look at. And so we've been looking at bluegills in that lake, and then we've been collecting bluegills from a lake, a more traditional lake where there is motorized boat access allowed. And so far with the bluegills, we have found that they don't really seem to be much impacted by sound. So that's good for us who like to angle. I think folks who are who angle for bluegills know that they're pretty aggressive fish, and they'll just kind of take any old bait. And there is there's a sensory and neural explanation for that as well. Bluegill sunfish don't tend to have very sensitive hearing. That's one of the things I've been looking at in my lab. I can do audiograms on fish, kind of like when you go to the hearing doctor and you want to get your hearing tested. We can do a similar thing on fish and see what frequencies they hear. And bluegill sunfish, their hearing is pretty low frequency. So I don't know of too many sounds that they actually produce. I think they tend to interact more through visual cues, and they maybe rely less on auditory signals. And so that's one species that, looking into other impacts in the environment on them, but doesn't seem like they're as impacted by sound. But if you're angling for, people love to go fishing for catfish. These are fish that are very sensitive to sound, and so they might be a little bit more impacted by boat noise in the environment.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I know you've already given us a few examples, but what are some ways that you collect data, and then how do you use that data in order to answer your research questions?
Yeah, no, that's a good question because I kind of touched on it a bit, but to really get into it, my lab is equipped to run physiology tests on fish, and so we can get a sense of their hearing thresholds, similar to humans. For folks who have ever gone to an audiologist, they'll play tones, and you have headphones on, and you can tell them, I heard that one, I didn't hear that one, and they get quieter and quieter, and that gives you a sense of what they're hearing, what a human's hearing threshold is, what frequencies we're most sensitive to, the range of frequencies that we can detect. And that's what I can do with fish. So I actually have an audiology booth in my lab, and we can record from fish using a physiology technique. And I do this with students in my lab. I just had a student over the summer testing bluegills in the lab with me. And then in order to get a sense of how they might be impacted by noise in the environment, we can introduce noise and then make some additional recordings and see if that changes their thresholds, kind of like when you're in a crowded room and you have to talk louder to hear your friends that you're chatting with.
Interesting. Is there anything you found particularly challenging when you're going on and collecting this data?
Yeah, I think I maybe alluded to this. It's always hard to get research animals. So, we've been making some trips up to St. Cloud to collect fish. Sometimes we have good luck collecting fish. Sometimes, you get skunked or you only get a few and you don't get as many as you want. So we're always a little bit at the whim of availability of organisms and just the scheduling of getting up there to collect fish. Yeah.
And with your research, are there any larger, more broad goals or impacts that you could imagine your research would have? Or are you really just trying to focus on understanding the behavior of fish when it comes to noise?
Yeah, I think using the example right now of bluegill, who don't seem to be all that impacted by noise, but I have studied fish species in the past that are, very much impacted by noise. During my postdoc at the University of Washington, I studied a fish species that they produce. Their whole reproductive cycle relies on a vocalization for the males attracting the females to a nest during their spawning season. And so there's been some research on how when there's boat noise in the environment, the males have to increase the duration of these calls. They have to try and produce them louder, which requires a lot more energy. It's pretty hard for a fish to produce a sound. They don't have, a vocal cords or like we do. And so it's a challenge for fish to produce sounds. And so that costs a lot of energy. And so it's important research because, we could determine times of year. Fish usually only spawn for a certain couple times of year, so we can look into other species in Minnesota. There's, freshwater drum, there's burbot. There are species that are known to produce vocalizations, and if we could avoid spawning areas, then maybe we could reduce our impact on them. So we just need to learn more about what frequencies would affect fish and when they're making noise.
Mm-hmm. And then this one's a little off topic.
Yeah,
so
that's all right.
You don't have to answer it, or you can take some time. But as we encounter issues like urban sprawl, more cars on the road, building highways, things that cause a lot of noise.
Yeah.
Are there any policies or actions that you're aware of that are taking place to protect these fish populations from that noise that could potentially impact their breeding cycles and, how they can thrive within their ecosystems?
That's a great question. We're still in kind of the early stages of understanding these noise effects on fish. Like I said, we really thought the bluegills would be impacted by this. We were pretty surprised, and that's sort of a lesson in general in science. You have this idea in your head, and the first summer we started putting these bluegills in tanks. I should back up a little bit and explain. We did neat foraging experiments where we collected fish and put them in a tank up at St. John's, and we played back boat motor noise, and then we looked to see how this would affect them foraging for minnows in the tank. And we did not see any change. The fish ate the minnows, no problem, regardless of whether there was sound or not. So we thought maybe it would cause them to be stressed, maybe it would impact their swimming. I've seen that response in other species, but it didn't really affect the bluegill. But we don't know how many fish will respond to these sounds. So it's still a lot in the early stages. So we don't have a lot of guidance we can provide at this point. But a great example to your question would be research that's been done in marine mammals. So marine mammals are also well known to produce a lot of sounds. They communicate through these, long calls, these high clicks. They use echolocation. They're producing a lot of sounds. And there's, a big market for tourism, for whale watching boats. And because of research on, the impacts of boats on whales, there's a lot of guidelines for how close these tourism vessels can get to the whales. They have to turn off their motors when they're near a pod of whales. And so these are all things that came out of similar research. We're just, quite a few years behind the marine mammal community. Marine mammals are pretty cool. So they're a high priority species to study when it comes to underwater sound. But we'll get there with fish, and that's part of what my lab is doing, is contributing to that so we can understand how we might be affecting fish.
Yeah. And then, I know you mentioned that people tend to find marine mammals tend to be, a hot thing for tourism, and that could be part of the reason why they're a few years ahead in research. But why has this not been touched on so thoroughly before?
That's a good question. I think really the looking at the effect of human-generated noise on animals in general is a relatively new topic.
Yeah.
So there was a paper published in, I want to say it was 2010. I should know this right off the top of my head, but nonetheless, not that long ago, since the year 2000 for sure. And it's called Noisy Spring. And it was kind of the first paper to really bring forth this as a concern. And that paper is specific to underwater noise. I do think that noise in the environment and its impact on birds and other, terrestrial organisms, that could be a longer research effort. I don't know as much about the terrestrial noise community, but there are folks who are doing research on terrestrial noise as well. And even the impact to humans. I mean, terrestrial noise has an impact on us as well. So I think we're really just learning about it. And, I think whales are a great kind of model species to get the whole community, research community going and looking into these topics. So,
would you plan on continuing your research just with marine animals, or would you ever look towards maybe some other species, different ecosystems, different environments?
So I'm mainly, now that I'm here at St. Thomas, study freshwater species, but I have studied marine species. I don't know if I would foray into the terrestrial noise environment, maybe for amphibians. Like I would be interested in maybe looking into frogs. There's a lot of frog research that's pretty neat, and frogs use, we all know on a summer night in Minnesota how much frogs are using acoustic communication, and so maybe that would be pretty neat. But it's something that would be kind of down the road. For now, there's enough to do with the freshwater fish in Minnesota. It's pretty unexplored.
Yeah, and they're a big deal around here.
Yeah. I mean, it's exciting and it's a fun thing to research. People always get really excited talking about fishing because we love to fish in Minnesota.
It's true.
Yeah.
And then I'm just curious, once you have your research, when you have the data collected, all written down, polished up, who uses that then?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. It gets published, put out in journals, and then it's sort of our job to get ideas out to the public. So I go to meetings. There's a meeting called The Effects of Noise on Aquatic Life. Yeah, it's a very niche meeting. And I've gone to this meeting now. It's every 3 years. I've gone to 4 of them. So I've been going to it for quite a while. And that's a really important way where we communicate our findings with, policymakers, regulators, other scientists, folks in industry. It's a very, interdisciplinary meeting. A lot of different people from different backgrounds come to that. And then more locally, I am becoming more connected to, I've been in Minnesota for a while, and then I was gone out to Seattle. So now that I'm back, I'm getting back involved with the kind of Minnesota fish research community. I go to the Minnesota American Fisheries meeting every year. So the American Fisheries Society is a national society, but we have our own chapter here in Minnesota, and we meet every year. There's folks from the Department of Natural Resources. There's folks from other government agencies, all the fisheries researchers from the U of M. We've got our own fisheries group here. Dr. Kyle Zimmer and his lab usually goes to this meeting, and we present and network and talk about these things. So that's kind of my way to connect with local folks. And I've actually had folks from the DNR help me collect fish, and they're really supportive. So it's a good community. Yeah.
Great. And then is there anything that you are looking forward to in the future that you have coming up on the horizon?
Yeah. It's so funny because now that I'm ending the summer, I've been so focused on all of the summer projects, I'm starting to think about that too. Like, what do I want to get to next? I do want to keep looking into this, effects of noise question, and this podcast has been really focused on that. But I do other things in my lab. I do some basic research looking at, how fish, just in general, their hearing abilities, behaviors in response to different sounds. And so I want to keep doing that research. and looking into exploring different species. I'd love to get some freshwater drum. I think those would be a really interesting species to study because they're a fish that produces sound. So I think getting into some fish species that produce sound, trying to track some of them down and study their hearing, characterize it, look at their behaviors.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you integrate undergrads into your research?
Yeah. I have worked with a lot of undergrads since I started at St. Thomas. We have such a great group of motivated students here, and I've had some really fantastic students that I've gotten to work with, especially students that come to my lab and I have for a few years in the lab, but even just ones that come for a summer. So I usually have around 4 or 5 students in the lab with me in the summers. They're a mix of students that are supported on UROP funding, and then also just bio student support. And, I have students trained to do behavioral, or I'll train and work with students to do behavioral studies. And then since I've been recording the thresholds from fish, I've trained a few students to do that as well. One of my students just presented her data at the Effects of Noise and Aquatic Life meeting in July, and that was in Prague. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, she
That's
graduated.
awesome.
I know, it was really great. She graduated in May, and the meeting has a pool of money that they can fund students to go. So that combined with, she got some funding from Europe, she was able to attend that with very minimal out-of-pocket expenses, just food and things like that. So we had a great time in Prague and talked to a lot of international colleagues and some really fun networking. I think it was her first time out of the country, and so that was a really cool experience to be able to bring her there. I got to bring a student to that meeting in 2022 in Berlin as well. My student, actually my very first research student, Cassie Kramer, attended that meeting with me. So I've gotten to bring 2 students to that meeting, and then we've also gone to some big national meetings. I go to one called the Society for Integrated and Comparative Biologists. Actually, I said that wrong. It's the Society for Integrative and Comparative Biologists, and taken students to that meeting. That one has a lot of really cool professional development events for students. So my goal is always to try and get students to present their data at a meeting, at the very least at our fantastic Europe poster session. But students who've been with me for a year or more usually end up going to a meeting as well, which is such a great experience for them.
And I'm just curious, when we have data that tells us about the relationship between how fish are affected by their behavior, affected by noise, can we use that to understand how noise might affect the behavior of other species as well, like even humans?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly, we can make some inferences about related species. So bluegill, for instance, are, sunfish. There's other ones like pumpkin seed. They're very closely related. It's likely that pumpkin seed would respond pretty similarly to bluegill. Of course, we always need to do the testing. But if we're going to, kind of make some inferences and guide future directions, maybe we don't need to focus on species like pumpkin seed. Maybe we need to go and look at other species that might be affected. I don't know too much about humans. Fish hearing and human hearing is so different that I don't know that we could make that much of a leap, at least from the behavior standpoint. But there's always inferences that you can make, and it'll lead you to your next question and the next step. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. Vetter.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. To learn more about her work, you can find her on the St. Paul campus of the University of St. Thomas. The Professor Podcast is brought to you by the St. Thomas Libraries. I'm your host, Sarah Brings, and the producers and library staff are Mary Davidson and Andrea Kepi. Thank you so much for our guests and to you, our listeners.